there's roughly 38 miles in the city of Sunbury, 40 at the high side of streets in the city. So if you divide that out in a 12-hour shift, if you spend 6 hours in doing paperwork and 6 hours in a cruiser, you can cover a lot of road miles in a shift running 25 mile an hour through the alleys and so forth. I was just wondering, to answer the general public's questions, you never see them. I just wonder how many road miles they had on the cruiser, trying to indicate if they're out there, if they're not out there, patrolling the streets.
I guess we could probably drill down into that and come up with some estimates with some of the basic information that you provided, if you feel that would be helpful.
Well, I personally, but the other council members speak up that that's necessary.
I mean, I'll go with yes, just because if someone asks, you can say, they're putting on X, it can change from day to day depending what's happening. Obviously, that's the case, but I would say it's a good number to have, because if people want to, people always say, oh, people aren't doing their job. Like, no, we can prove it. This is what they're doing. This is a simple thing. So I think it's a good thing a good number or statistic to have.
Driving the patrol vehicle doesn't dictate that they're working.
Well, no, it's just say, people always say, well, I never see DPW out working. Like we say, no, we do X, you've done this. Like I said, it's just a good number. I mean, I don't see a harm in saying, if someone asks, like, no, our guys on average do whatever. I'm just saying.
Has anybody on the board got to approach Chief here to get this information?
I would ask you, you're the mayor.
I feel like we're skipping.
The point of this report, though, would be to find like efficiency things or cost saving things or long-term model. That's a simple thing to me that I think we could just look at when the last inspections were, how many miles were on it today, how many miles last inspection. I don't know that for these guys, if for this report, that having that in there is going to benefit us in any way.
Well, I appreciate that.
You were just asking that because if they had it, so that would
Because
be
they had it without being good in house,
Okay.
Slack does a cruiser, so he probably all the mileage is listed.
We write the mileage is done every day on the ground. There's so many variables in fact.
Well, the only variable I'm looking for is the mayor said about just because we drive around doesn't mean working. They are working. I can control it. That's work to me.
So there's more to the police work than just driving a cruiser.
Well, I mean, that's an argument for another day. Like I said, if it was in, I think it was just asking if it's in there, that's great. If it's not in there, like Chris said, we can just find the number out. I think it was just a general curious question.
I guess the question I would have, so obviously you guys had questions about the shift recommendations and things like that. Did you guys get back in touch with them since then?
I talked to people about that.
Okay, so like that was my question then. The recommendations, did that take anything into effect of like the in-house calls that we're receiving to the station? So that's a question for you guys on the Zoom calls. Other than just the county calls, did those recommendations of the shorter shifts and the not needing an extra officer and all that kind of stuff, did that come from all of that, or where did that all come from?
Well, let me explain a little bit about the staffing model that we use. It's not really management partners staffing model. The model was really developed by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and it's the one that they recommend as being the most objectively accurate for determining staffing needs. And it takes everything into consideration, the way that they have it structured, not just calls for service. That's what drives, that's the independent variable, if you will, in the model. And that drives the rest of the model. But the model also starts out with figuring out how much time is an officer really available to do their work. They're scheduled 2,080 hours a year, but obviously vacation, sick leave, other forms of leave, reduces the amount of availability time. So that's taken right off the top. So your historic experience in terms of leave is factored into the formula. So vacation, sick leave, anything that makes an officer unavailable to do their work. We've aggregated that and plugged that in to the formula based on your actual experience over the last 5 years. And then what the formula does is it divides it, an officer's work into three modules. Dispatch calls for service, which is the independent variable, and then the IACP says that should consume about 33% of an officer's time, dispatch calls for service. Then another 33% of the officer's time is consumed by administrative work, writing reports, meeting with their supervisor, things of that nature, court time, and that 33% of administrative time then is factored into the formula. And then another 33%, the final 33%, is what they say that should be programmed in for tactical operations. In other words, your choice of how you want an officer's non-dispatch calls for service time used. And it might be for anything depending upon what it is. Tactical operations is basically what we call it. So all of that is taken into consideration. Calls that come into the office, the department, and then are result in an officer's response. That goes into that 33% of the time. So what the formula does then is it figures, we went back and we looked at your actual dispatch calls for service over the last 5 years, and we figured out what the average time per call was, and that gave us a total number of hours that are needed to respond to dispatch calls for service. We also know what 1/3 of an officer's time is that they're actually available. So let's say they're scheduled for 2,080 hours, but they're only available 1,800 hours. That means that 600 of those hours are for dispatch calls for service. So then when we see what the total demand is for dispatch calls for service, let's say that it's 6,000 hours, just to make the math simple. And they've got 600 hours per officer available to do those 6,000 hours, right? That means that you got 10. That's a factor of 10. And that's saying, well, you need 10 patrol officers. And that 10 patrol officers, then 33% of their time is available for dispatch calls for service. 33% of their time then is available for administrative work. And the other 600 hours is available to do what it is you direct them to do. That's the way the formula works. So it takes everything into consideration.
So after the initial report was drafted, those extra numbers were sent in, Brad? So after that was sent, did the recommendation change at all at that point? After the extra calls were given then? No, they didn't need to, because the formula considered that at the beginning.
If I can add,
In other words, the extra calls fall into that 33% of the time when you direct them to do certain activities.
Chris, what was the extra calls that came up with?
It was in-house calls, so people that called the station direct. So originally they had given just calls from the 911 center, but then Brad thought that they weren't factoring in the calls directly to the station that were also dispatching the officer.
And they say their formula, they consider that into that formula.
So that's part of the what they're being, but though, wouldn't that be different? I mean, maybe this is just me being understanding. If a call is being directly to the station, but they're being dispatched, wouldn't that still be a call? I mean, if the chief wants them surveilling traffic, or working on drug cases, or things, or child abuse, whatever it be, to me, wouldn't that factor into the 600? And then, or maybe I just need to understand it better. Are they different?
think that tactical operation would be, and that would be the tactical operation.
In the 600.
Yeah, well, yeah, we got.
Well, Chris, my question is, which I never called the station for a call. I didn't know we just called Brad to call 911, but my question is, someone would call the station and they would go out and call. Don't they call county to say respond to X call?
I don't know. What's that? Do they call?
Yeah, it's Joe Blow calls the police department, says they have an accident over here. And they get into cruiser, don't they call county and say responding to an accident at such location?
On that aspect, yeah, but there are some calls that come into the station that do not get called to the county. County only gets the 911 non-emergency calls. There's people that walk in and like, oh, I have a hit and run, and then you do the report of it. It's not dispatched with the county. It doesn't get counted into those numbers. But what they're saying is they already factor in that there's some calls that come in, and that part of their formula is takes those calls into consideration.
So that's already factored into
That's what
day
they're
one.
saying.
Right. Yeah, what the IACP says is that for every officer, you should consider that their time available, not the time that they're scheduled, but their actual time available, all right, should be divided into 3 different types of activity. Dispatch calls for service, which comes through your 911 center, all right, 33% of their time, all right, and then you should allow 33% of their time for administrative work, writing reports, going to court, whatever you would consider administrative work, okay? And then the final 1/3 of their time is for directed patrol, tactical operations. In other words, if a call comes into the station and the chief says, all right, we need to send somebody to respond to this, okay? That falls into that 33% of the officer's time. So in the example that I just used, you got 600 hours of their time that's available for dispatch calls for service, 600 hours of their time available for administrative work, and 600 hours of their time that's unallocated to be used however you want. So if you have, for example, based on the formula that, or the example I just used, that you need 10 police officers, you've got 6,000 hours of police officer time that you can use to direct them to do whatever you want, and another 6,000 hours for administrative time. So that's the way the International Association of Chiefs of Police says this is the most logical way for you to compute how many officers you need depending upon doing police work. So it's the model that's used by thousands of police departments across the country to really determine what their staffing needs are. And it's the one that this isn't the model. We didn't develop this model. This is the model that we find has been the most appropriate. It's recommended by the professionals in police services. They say, if you want to figure it out, this is the best model to use. You're going to come closest to what your real needs are than any other way. And you can play around with that. For example, instead of using their recommendation of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, you can say, okay, we're going to allocate 40% of the time for directed patrol, and then the other 60% is divided evenly between administrative and directed. Or if for some reason you are very, very efficient, and you want to really do a time and motion study, you say, well, maybe only 15% of our time really goes to administrative work, then you know that you've got a lot more time to do directed patrol rather than dispatch calls for service. But what we follow is the International Association of Chiefs of Police recommendation.
Is there anything on that? You got that?
You have anything regarding the shifts?
No, I mean, right now the 12s are working as is because of Friday 10. looking at a 10 and the model just doesn't fit with the number of people we have.
How many people would you need for a 10 to work?
We had a 10-hour schedule years ago, when we had 12, we were down then, 12, and it worked out really, actually perfectly, with the 10-hour schedule. But with the manpower that we have now, losing another one and having to train two new ones probably coming in, the 12-hour works better. Now, when I put out a 12-hour schedule, you have to understand it's a projected schedule at the beginning of the year. In December, I put that out December 1st of every year. That is a projected schedule. That schedule is subject to change obviously for operational purposes. So during the year, and I put it out a couple months ahead of time, and I have already changed it. We started this year by moving basically one person from 7 to 3, and then at 3, there's 2 other people coming out, and then there's one at night. So there's always 3 people from barring vacation, sick time, all that stuff. From 3 to 3, there's 3 people out to cover probably the most of your calls you get. Some of the other factors that go into scheduling is court time. There's in the mornings on Tuesdays, every Tuesday, there's court from 8:45, and that goes from 8:45 to 1 o'clock. I can't have everybody working day shift to go to court, because then there's nobody to work night shift. And that's part of the other reasons why I move some people around on the Mondays and Tuesdays to prevent more overtime than there already is. If you look at the chart, last year I saved a lot of overtime. Most of the overtime came from investigation. That is another factor that comes in. We don't have divisions in our department that have, detective bureau and traffic bureau, and we're a one-stop shop. Everybody, you get the call, you catch it, you got to investigate it, you got to prosecute it, and you have to go to court for it. You have to do it all. So a lot of those things are into factor. One of the things with the the advocacy center with the CAC interviews and stuff like that is one officer, 2 of them actually dedicated, but one that has to sit there for hours at a time. She will sit there from the time she gets in at 7 in the morning until 7 at night watching video and transcribing everything. So that's some of the things that they're on taking somebody that's not able to get on the street to do the active patrols. These aren't just patrol officers; these are police officers. They're doing it all. So that for us, it's a problem. If you look at some of the models that they use, they're for larger departments. The larger departments have those divisions where they do a lot more. Where they like years ago when we had detectives, the patrol officer would come in, they had a burglary or anything serious, and they would pass it off onto the detective. So the detective had that time. That's what their dedication was, just to do that part. So it does become problematic as the smaller departments. It becomes problematic because I don't have somebody dedicated 100% all the time. Last year we had an anomaly of a lot of major incidents that happened last year. So if you look at the investigation part, most of our overtime was in investigations. The second most time was court. We don't control the courts. They control us. So when they schedule these things, we can't just not show up. You might have one court case, and you're sitting there for 3 hours, and there's nothing you can do about it because they pile them all in one day, prelim days. So that becomes that. I have to factor that in too, and I have a large lump sum of court hearings on those days, on Tuesdays, and then you have trials. And there's so much to factor in when it comes to some of these cases. Shift coverage itself was mostly because we're still building and we have people on probation and we can't let them out on their own. Obviously, that dwindled down. Reimbursable, where we use a lot of our directed control, DUI checkpoints, traffic enforcement, stuff like that. So, and that's usually on their off time, after hours or days off. So a lot of our directed patrol comes in that. Now, do they get out and do directed patrols when they're assigned to do things like bank checks, building checks at night. Those are directed patrols that they have to do at night to get out, street sweeper, stuff like that. So those are things that they do go out for directed patrols, but when they're out, that's the other reason we have the cars set up as mobile stations. So if they are out and about, it's not optimal. I don't like them to be sitting at a corner typing up their reports because it's a safety factor too. So there's just so many variables in smaller departments. I don't know what the smallest department they've ever done. I don't know municipality wise what's the smallest one they've done. I don't know. Well,
What would you guys say? Just from what the chief said as far as, our department compared to what you guys have seen and done in the past, what would you compare that, I guess?
Well, I can recall doing a department that had 10 officers, which is close to what you have. Keith, what, the one that we just did in Crestview Hills, do you recall how many police officers there were in that one?
Crestview, Lakeside Park, Crestview Hills Police Department, it's a merged police department. 12 officers, I believe, plus the chief.
So we've done a number of small departments just like yours that, uses their folks in the same way that you do. And I would say that, from what we saw of the Sunbury Police Department, it's pretty darn efficient. There's a lot of work that gets done. You're using your people very well. Our staffing analysis said that, you're right on the money in terms of the number of people that you should have. The only thing I think we wanted to get into your consciousness was the idea that, from our experience, the 12-hour shift for police departments is less desirable from an operations point of view based on what research has been done by the Police Executive Research Foundation, the IACP, other professional industry organizations. And so we just wanted to raise that and say, maybe it's a good idea to take a good look at the 10-hour models that are out there and see if there's one that might fit you better, because the research says that from an officer safety point of view, from a community liability point of view, from an overtime, a cost point of view, that the 10-hour shifts are generally found to be more advantageous. Now, not one size fits all, right? And that's why we suggested to the chief that he look at some of the models and see if for the 10-hour shift, to see if there was one that might fit a little bit better in terms of saving you some money in regards to overtime.
So, this was obviously a small part. There's a lot of recommendations that you guys made. So you guys are good at along with the outlet rep. So you guys are here from the fire department, obviously. Fire chiefs are here. So there's a few recommendations in the our fire and ambulance services. I guess first, chiefs, do you guys have any questions or anything on that? Before I ask what I have, do you guys have any questions based off the recommendations that were made in the report on fire?
Not really. I mean, the portfolio, just the fire department doing pretty good.
Say again?
The call volumes that we do in the report do not include the fire department.
How long did they pull?
Yes.
Okay.
So for that, you would want to add another 3,600. It's a little bigger than 3,000. Basically 400 calls a year, 4,000. It's the annual involved in that, which changes a lot. The recommendations, I think, are good. When the fire department falls under the hose, when we get funded from the city, but we're separate. For the little bit that we get, anybody that has ever been around a fire company or something, $10,000 doesn't go to any company. I do see where they recommend where there's that the management partners scope wasn't to look in depth in the fire department. Is that something that we can get with the city with and try and do that better? Consolidation is the end goal. There's no question that we need all the apparatus that we have. So, I guess the department and the city needs to work together to try and get some kind of game plan to look at the fire department side. Or are they suggesting that the city take over the fire department and fund it? Because that's a lot.
No, I think the suggestion, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it was more of a, so right now the funding is going individually to each station, right? So it's 10 per station. It was more of rather turning it into a pot of money that the fire department as a whole could pull from, not individualized to each station. So if the fire department board was to feel that one station needed $20,000 for a new engine, or to put towards a new engine, or $20,000 for equipment merchandise upgrades, but another station didn't need anything that year, it would be up to the fire department to dictate where that money would go, rather than here's 10, here's 10, here's 10, everyone buy, you buy a shovel, you buy a shovel, you buy a shovel, everybody buys what they need, rather than just, hey, spend your 10, you know what I mean? And correct me if I'm wrong, please, but that was kind of how I took the report on the fire department side, and it's a starting basis of eventually leading down the road of consolidation, first internally and then next.
I mean, the main goal at the end of the day is consolidation, which, I mean, we can cut down on apparatus, we can cut down on the spending, we're funding 6 places that theoretically from the fire department, we don't need, to serve fire protection for the city. At the end of it, consolidation, everybody's in one building, the manpower is strung out throughout the city. If it's all in one place, you don't need to be trying to maintain all this apparatus. The city does purchase the hose, and we have so much of it. You're putting wise in that, there's just a lot of multiple things that we probably don't need. But is that something that the department, I guess, the city's willing to help the fire department to try to get that process?
That's a question, Mike Carpenter.
Yes, he is.
So from a DCED standpoint, we were talking about last time, there's services within DCED that I think maybe the department had looked at a while back, that I don't know if you guys had someone from DCED come and meet with the department to talk to each department about the consolidation process. But could you kind of give us an idea of how that works? Because I know that's one of the recommendations, and kind of go down if the recommendation makes sense on where to start.
Councilman, are you asking me, Mike Carpenter?
Yeah, I think you brought it up last time about the services in the consolidation area that we may have not had before.
Sure. So DCD has staff in the Center for Local Government Services that concentrate on both fire department and police consolidation, or for police, obviously regionalization. But for the city of Sunbury, for example, you have multiple fire companies within the city that if it's like a lot of other Northeastern volunteer fire companies do a tremendous job for their local communities, and obviously it's all volunteers, so the amount of savings to each municipality as a result of being volunteers is quite astronomical, to put it mildly, if you had to pay those people. With that being said, if the city and their fire department would like to look at the possibility of consolidating those individual companies to see if it would make sense to have a centrally located station that would house your apparatus, of course, where your manpower would all report to one station to then obviously respond to those calls that come in for assistance, whether that be fire, emergency. In the city's case, you have also the river rescue, those gentlemen that are trained. So you could, again, we offer, and it's no cost to the city, the fire department and or the city, a combination of both, would just need to make a request to DCD that you'd like to look at studying that consolidation. We then have consultants. They're basically fire service individuals, people who serve professionally as in the fire service. They they come out and they visit with the various fire departments, the chiefs, the line officers. They look at all the demographic information and they come back and let you know if it's feasible and makes sense to do that. We see that that service is one that we do get requests for quite often. And if the city's interested, they just need to make an inquiry with me formally, and then I will pass that on to the staff that oversees that process, and we can look at that.
We got thumbs up and back from all the chiefs that they're interested in that. So Derek, if you're okay coordinating that with like to start just that process of exploring it just to see if it's there, because that was an interesting recommendation. So I mean, just from that point,
I think it's good, and I think, keeping the city involved with the fire department, they are technically funding the department. I think that everybody being on the same page, working together, is the best thing for all of us.
I agree.
And from my standpoint, as someone that's a volunteer fireman itself and works for the city, in the long run, this is going to save the city and possibly the state money, because the longer you can have volunteers around, it's, you don't have to have paid. So in the long run, I get it. We only give out $80,000 annually now, but if we had to go to the paid departments, the city has a duty to provide fire service. So we would probably have to chip in a astronomical amount of money to help with the paid department. So from that standpoint, this is going to save us money and keep the longevity of volunteerism around, hopefully, for years to come. So
When you look at apparatus, correct, ladder truck's 20 years old, that's $1.4 million right now to replace.
correct.
And, I believe the city did fund something for the last one, a portion, but that's a lot of money that has come through other places and stuff. Our busiest engine in the city that has the most manpower is the oldest. And if that goes down, we're reset right now. How do, from the fire department, if we don't look into things, we can't go to somebody else and move the fire truck from one station to another to keep the protection up. And to buy an engine now is $500,000. Fire apparatus is expensive and everything is. So if we can try and figure something out there, work together. And seriously,
I don't think it's an issue. You have a fire department, and the biggest thing is how are you going to look at funding to do something like this? We've had this discussion several years ago when we talked about consolidation. It was a fire department issue. We talked about consolidation. I believe at that time it was after the friendship.
Yes.
And we talked about that, and there was a committee put together, and we had a meeting here. You might have been here, Chris.
I was. It was the first I got on count.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you were here because you were in charge of the streets of the.
Yeah. It was my first meeting I went to.
Right, but you were interested in that whole situation. I think you might have been here. Yeah. Were you here?
Yeah.
Okay. I think, yeah. And I believe everybody was here, including that.
It was all internal, right?
Yeah.
It was all internal.
And so we talked about doing that, but the point that we keep stumbling about is how do you share the cost and the money that's going to be required to say, and we all recognize, this is something that's been recognized back, you might have even been a junior at that time. Yeah, you guys might have been juniors at that time when we talked about this. Back, I think that was like 2005, I believe, 2004. We talked about consolidation back then, and the whole process that got moneyed up was the fact that how do you come up with the money to pay for what you're going to do, and where are you going to locate something like this, and who's going to come up with the seed money to build a fire station? If you're going to put a fire station up, you're going to need a fairly large complex to house everything, and who's going to pay for the replacement of vehicles, and who's going to decide which vehicles need to be replaced? As Chief Long said,
ladder truck's 20 years old. We bought that with $620,000, I think, or $606,000.
It's about 750 till we done outfitted.
Right, and then now it's 1.4 million. Americus does not have $1.4 million to buy a new ladder truck. Now, the city was part of that financing, and a lot of it, some of it also came from the Degestein Foundation, who took care of some things for us. But $750,000 is a lot of money, but that, and we sold our ladder truck. We don't get much for a new ladder truck. It's only 100,000, somewhere around that now. Yeah, somewhere around there. But it wasn't a whole lot of money. There is no, we know for a long time, the chiefs know this, there's an overabundance of engines, underabundance of other things. We have a rescue truck. I need to staff a rescue truck. There's a lot of variables that go into this, and it isn't so easy to say you're going to consolidate when you have 6 individual companies with all their own federal identification number for taxes who generate revenue to pay for their own equipment, and now you're going to tell them you're going to pay for something else. Well, there's a lot of politics that goes on in the fire companies, for each fire company, which you may or may not know, because of being volunteer and being in the coal region, where the type of fire service is slightly different than a lot of other places. There's bars attached to all these companies, and and each company is run individually. I don't know how you turn around and say one that you're going to pay this amount and another you're going to pay this amount. So, if there's a way that DCE can come in and maybe shed some light on that, that would be great. But we are not Watsontown. We are not Lancaster, the Lancaster area. We're not Williamsport or up in the northern tier or down in Spokane County. The area that we are is the way fire service is, and the city of Sunbury cannot afford fire service or ambulance service, EMS, fire EMS, let's just put it that way. You could never be able to do that with our tax base here, never, ever, ever. So
That's what they would look at when they come in and go over things, right?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I mean, you guys always did it internal, so it was never. And Mike can probably answer it. I mean, that's what you see.
It was looked at back in 2005. There was a big study that was done. There was a lot of work that was put into that. A lot of meetings that were done with that. And I believe, Jim, you probably remember this back then. That's when former Mayor Persing wanted all the audit reports and financial data and all kinds of stuff. All the departments, all the companies involved in that, because what we do has no concern of yours. Well, unless you're going to still start funding beyond $80,000.
Mr. Alex, let's back up though. Mr. Backer has experience in the fire department. Didn't get with the state, get a study done, and let's work it from the study out.
But the study has to be done with the fire department, not with the city.
No, that's what I'm
saying.
talking about.
Fire
I
department
mean,
and the
the
city.
fire department has to be the key person in this study, not the city. The city has no vested interest in it.
No,
$80,000
$80,000
Yeah,
in a $4.5 million budget.
okay.
Okay.
So we can pull the 80,000?
Well, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying we're putting in the cost of that is $500,000.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So when one of the companies is looking at buying a new piece of equipment, they're not coming to the city, and the city ain't giving any money for that.
Wait a second, we're getting off track here.
Yeah.
We need a study done, what the city needs,
Yeah.
equipment wise. That's what
Okay.
we want to start.
And that's a totally different thing when you talk about what the city needs based on what the recommendations are of, say, what's the insurance, the ISO ratings? The ISO ratings are gonna show you something totally different than what we have right now.
But you have to, you have to be compatible. That rating you have to be able to.
Let's get the study.
But the study.
We're gonna have
Oh, absolutely. Gotta have
Hey
a study.
Hey guys, this is Mike Carpenter again. So let me just, I don't want to get too far off topic here, what we're here for this evening. So back to the request for a study. There's any one of a number of reasons that municipalities very similar to Sunbury, all volunteer, similar size and population, some of the same demographics as Sunbury, choose to have a consolidation study done. Some of that is lack of manpower. We're seeing that across the northeast of Pennsylvania, where lack of volunteers and response from individual companies differs to the point where you may have 6 companies, and I'm not saying this is your case to the chief, but you may have 6 companies and a fire call goes out, but you only get 2 of the 6 responding during the middle of the day because of lack of manpower. That is, in some areas, enough concern to have the municipality and, more importantly, their fire department, which have individual charters and bureaus, etc. They need to be very much in the lead in this process. So what I'm saying in short is you have to have a reason to want to consolidate. I don't know that the report is necessarily, the initial report that I seen was recommending a consolidation effort. I think what we're saying is if the city is interested in looking at that, that's a possibility. But somebody, and I'm not sure who I'm speaking to, and I apologize, but somebody mentioned the cost, and that's a critical factor. Obviously, the consolidation of 6 fire companies, all who have social quarters, I assume, into one centrally located fire station, that's not going to have a social quarters. That's strictly for housing apparatus. That's going to take, number one, control of property to put a structure of that nature on. Number 2, the structure itself to house that apparatus. The report would also help to establish an asset calculation, exactly what does the fire department as it sits and stands now, what is your worth? What do you have that you can leverage, if you will, to accomplish something like that? But I think you need to know there's a large price tag that accompanies consolidation. And so, what would be your purpose of consolidation would be number one. In some areas, municipalities are doing it strictly out of a lack of manpower. And in that case, they're looking at, if we don't have volunteers, we need to provide service. What's it going to cost us? They're forced with the option to look at consolidation. I don't know if the city of Sunbury is in that situation, but what I would say is if you're interested in a study, you should also be looking at long-term. If that study comes back and says, yes, you should consider consolidation, you got to consider that there's a price tag that goes along with that. And the member companies are going to need to be committed to that, obviously financially and other, to make that happen. And your involvement with the city to see that process through, and what, if anything, the city can participate in would be something between the member companies and the city. But it's not an easy undertaking, but if you want to look at it, again, you have that opportunity. But there's various reasons why municipalities look at consolidation. And there's a couple that went on not too far from where Sunbury's located. I know the one example I guess I could use would be Bloomsburg. They consolidated and have one central station in the town of Bloomsburg. Not totally the same as the city of Sunbury in landmass and population, but with the university there, during the peak school hours, I would say that they're close in demographics. But anyway, I just wanted to make that point before we start digressing here. Again, give some thought if you're really interested in a consolidation study for whatever the reasons are, financially, manpower, combination of both. Please, don't hesitate to ask. Thanks.
Thank you.
It's necessary, there's no doubt about it.
What's that?
It's necessary, no doubt about it.
Good, so we can at least start.
Oh, absolutely.
From there.
All right, back into the staff report. Anything else, because we only have like another 15 minutes.
I don't personally have anything else as far as like the recommendations that were made. I think that the big part is now finalizing the report and starting to implement what we can, into practice. I guess that would be the question. Where do we go next? From your guys' end, what would be the next step other than actual implementation?
Well, one of the things that we include in our final reports is what we call an implementation action plan. And what we do is with each recommendation, each individual recommendation, we break it down into its component steps. What are the things that need to be accomplished? We give a sort of a broad time frame, the amount of effort that it's going to take. So we basically try to give you a roadmap to follow in terms of implementing the recommendations, each recommendation. Sam, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
No, Wayne, I think you nailed it. That the action plan is really to help you all, and we give it to you guys in draft form, knowing that you'll put your imprint on it. But it is our first cut at helping you guys with thinking through the steps involved to actually implement the recommendations that we've made in the report. And so, as Wayne said, we will deliver that with our final report.
Thank you. Anything else from anybody? Great job, gentlemen. Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the feedback. It's very helpful.
Thank you.